Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we are going to be tackling something that a lot of you have been requesting, and that is the stages of porn addiction. We've got some really interesting sources lined up, basically trying to figure out how something that starts out seemingly harmless
Mm.
can actually become a pretty serious problem. And,
Oh,
and get this right off the bat, one study found that 93% of boys and 62% of girls are exposed to porn before they even turn 18.
yeah. I mean, that's a staggering statistic. It really highlights how accessible this kind of content is these
Mhm.
days. We often talk about the impact of early exposure to porn, but the sheer prevalence of it is something we can't ignore.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy, right?
Just
Okay, so let's break this down. Our main source here outlines 6 distinct stages of porn addiction, starting with stage 1, initial exposure. And usually, this isn't, someone deliberately seeking out this type of content. It's accidental clicks, pop-up ads, even stuff that pops up on social media feeds.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And it's that accidental nature that I think is so deceptive. Because even if it's unintentional, that first exposure still triggers the brain's reward system. Dopamine gets released, and suddenly that connection is made between porn and pleasure.
Right, so it's like laying the foundation for a habit, even if you don't realize it's happening. But here's where it gets really interesting. Dopamine doesn't just make us feel good. It actually starts to shape our learning process.
Exactly. Our brains become wired to seek out whatever triggered that dopamine rush, even if down the line, it becomes harmful. It's like a shortcut is created in our neural pathways.
So even if someone thinks, oh, it's just a one-time thing, their brain might already be, starting down that path of wanting more. It's a little unsettling, right?
It is, yeah. And that kind of leads us right into stage two, regular consumption. This is where we shift from those accidental encounters to actively seeking out the content. It might start subtly, as a
Yeah.
way to unwind after a long day, or even just to fill a few minutes of boredom.
Yeah. And I think at this stage, a lot of people might rationalize their behavior, like, oh, everyone does it, you know. But what's often overlooked is this concept of tolerance.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Just like with drugs or alcohol, the more we consume, the less sensitive our brains become. What was once stimulating might not cut it anymore, leading to a need for more frequent viewing, or even more intense content to get that same level of arousal.
That makes sense. But is there any actual scientific evidence to back that up?
Oh, yeah, tons. Dr. Norman Doidge, a psychiatrist and researcher, found that overconsumption of porn can literally rewire the brain. In his 2007 study, he demonstrated how this rewiring can create a craving for more and more extreme material just to get that same dopamine hit.
Whoa, so we're not just talking about a psychological effect here. There are actual physical changes happening in the brain.
Precisely. And what's fascinating is that these changes can start to influence our behavior in very subtle ways, even if we don't consciously realize it. It's like our brains are being primed for a more intense experience.
Which I imagine leads us to stage 3, problematic consumption. This is where those real-life consequences start to creep in.
Right. This is where the line between, a private habit and a real problem starts to blur. Think about it. You're staying up late watching porn, neglecting your responsibilities, maybe even calling in sick to work because you just can't tear yourself away from the screen.
It's like your need for that dopamine rush starts to outweigh, your awareness of the negative impact it's having on your life.
One statistic that really jumped out at me from our research was that porn is involved in a staggering 56% of divorce cases. That's a huge red flag.
It is. It really speaks to the power of this type of addiction to create real rifts in relationships. Think about, the underlying issues here. Communication breakdowns, feelings of betrayal, intimacy issues. Porn addiction can exacerbate all of these.
Yeah, it's like a domino effect. One problem creates another, and pretty soon it's impacting every area of your life. Exactly, and that's where we see the shift from simply satisfying a need to relying on porn as a harmful coping mechanism. It becomes the go-to solution for stress, loneliness, boredom, you name it. And that's when things can really start to spiral.
So we talk about how porn consumption can escalate from curiosity to actually a problematic coping mechanism.
Yeah.
But when does it cross the line into full-blown addiction?
That's where we enter stage four, dependence. And what's really alarming here is the loss of control. It's not even about enjoyment anymore, it's a compulsion. You want to stop? but the urges are just too strong.
I bet that must be like a terrifying feeling, to know that something is harming you, but feeling totally powerless to stop.
Exactly. Your brain has basically been hijacked by the addiction.
Huh.
Your thoughts become preoccupied with porn. You're constantly looking for opportunities to watch it, even planning your day around it.
Yeah, our sources mentioned some pretty extreme examples, like
Hmm.
people avoiding social events, even skipping important work meetings.
Hmm.
Just because they can't shake that urge to watch porn, it's like their entire life starts revolving around it.
Yeah. It's a powerful cycle, fueled by those same neurochemical changes we talked about earlier. The brain's reward system is completely out of whack. And those intense cravings can manifest as, anxiety, irritability,
Mhm.
even physical restlessness when you can't satisfy them.
So it's not even just a mental struggle, there's a very real physical component to it, too. And speaking of physical effects, one of our sources highlighted a link between dependence and sexual dysfunction.
Right. And it might seem kind of counterintuitive at first. You'd think that frequent exposure to sexual content would make you more, experienced. But a 2016 study actually found that young men who were heavy porn users were actually more likely to experience things like erectile dysfunction and premature ejaculation when it came to real life intimacy.
But why? Isn't sex supposed to be, natural? Why would porn have that kind of effect?
It comes down to how our brains learn and adapt. When you're constantly exposed to the highly stimulating and often unrealistic scenarios in porn, your brain essentially becomes desensitized to real life sexual experiences.
It's like your brain starts to prefer the instant gratification and exaggerated stimuli of porn
Uh-huh.
over the complexities and nuances of an actual human connection.
Exactly. And that desensitization is a key feature of stage 5, which takes us into even darker territory. It's not just about needing more frequent viewing, it's about needing more extreme or shocking content to get that same level of arousal.
That's scary to think about, that the brain becomes so used to this like hyperstimulation that it needs increasingly intense material to even register a response.
It's a classic example of the brain's ability to adapt. But in this case, that adaptation takes us down a dangerous path. The source we're looking at here compares it to like a drug addict needing higher and higher doses to get the same effect.
So you're chasing a high that you can never quite reach. And I imagine that in this stage, people might start seeking out content that goes against their own values, maybe even crossing legal boundaries just to satisfy those cravings.
Yeah, that's a real risk. And it shows how powerful addiction can be to override, logic and reason. The need to feed that craving, to experience that dopamine rush, becomes all consuming.
And sadly, it often takes hitting rock bottom before people realize the extent of the damage.
You're right. And that brings us to stage 6, crisis points. This is where the consequences of porn addiction become impossible to ignore. Lost jobs, shattered relationships, severe financial problems, even legal
So it's
issues.
not even just about the individual anymore. It's about the ripple effect of their addiction on everyone around them.
Exactly. Think about a husband whose wife discovers his addiction, or a parent who gets caught by their child. The feelings of shame, guilt, and betrayal can be utterly devastating.
And I imagine that for a lot of people, reaching this point is what finally pushes them to get help, like they've been in denial for so long.
Right.
But the reality of the situation finally becomes too painful to ignore.
Absolutely. And while it's heartbreaking to think of people going through this level of pain, there's also a glimmer of hope in the fact that this is often the turning point. It's when they finally acknowledge that they need help and start taking steps toward recovery.
This has been a really intense deep dive, going from, seemingly innocent first encounters with porn all the way to like the devastating consequences of addiction. It's clear that this isn't just, a moral failing or something. This is a real struggle with some really serious implications.
Yeah, it's definitely a tough topic. And what's especially concerning is just how closely these stages mirror what we see in substance abuse. The tolerance, build up the cravings, the withdrawal symptoms when you try to stop. It's all eerily similar.
I think that's what surprised me the most doing this research. It's easy to dismiss porn addiction as like an all in your head kind of thing. But when you look at the evidence, like the actual neurological evidence, it's obvious that there are some very real physiological changes happening in the brain.
Absolutely. That's why it's so important to approach this with the same level of seriousness and compassion as any other addiction. It's not about willpower or making moral judgments. It's about understanding the underlying, neurochemical processes that are actually driving this behavior.
So for our listener out there who might be relating to some of these stages, what's the takeaway? What can they actually do if they're feeling trapped in this cycle?
Well, the first step is recognizing that you're not alone in this. Millions of people struggle with compulsive porn use. And there is absolutely no shame in seeking help. In fact, it's a sign of incredible strength to acknowledge that you need support.
That's so important. There's so much stigma surrounding this topic.
Yeah.
But addiction doesn't discriminate. It can affect anyone, regardless of, their age, background, or beliefs.
Exactly. And just like with any addiction, the path to recovery starts with reaching out for professional help. There are therapists who specialize in porn addiction. They can give you the tools and strategies you need to break free from this cycle.
What about like support groups? Are those helpful for people struggling with this?
For sure, support groups provide a safe and non-judgmental space to connect with others who really get it. It can be so powerful to hear other people's stories, share your own experiences, and just realize that you're not alone in this fight.
So it sounds like there's a whole network of support out there. For people who are ready to take that first step, that's got to be reassuring.
It is, and it's important to remember that recovery is a journey, not a destination. There will be ups and downs, challenges and setbacks, but with the right support, lasting change is totally possible.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with this. If you're struggling with compulsive porn use, don't give up hope. You're worthy of healing, and you deserve to live a life free from this addiction.
And remember, knowledge is power. Now that you have a deeper understanding of these stages, you can start to identify patterns in your own behavior and make informed choices about your well-being.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, take care of yourselves.